I searched the woods but he wasn't, there was nothing. They took him. This is a No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 2 of season 6. Last time, we talked a bit about the history of literature that deals with alien invasion, and today we are looking at another classic in the genre, Fire in the Sky.
All right, so on our last episode, we did talk a little bit about kind of what might be scary about something invading Earth, because when we're talking about alien invasions here, we're talking about somebody else coming to our planet that we might not be able to fight off. That was one of the things we really talked about. And we centered a lot of that conversation on the War of the Worlds. And we kind of viewed it through that lens. But it occurred to me, and it kind of occurred to us as we were talking, that when you're talking about alien invasion movies and alien invasion narratives, you really can kind of go one of two ways. You either have the War of the Worlds type stories where aliens land and it ends up being a wide-scale invasion that affects a lot of things and kicks off some sort of war. So a lot of these narratives were useful for kind of the fears around nuclear war, the fears around like a world war. All of that makes sense, that you could see like an enemy invading, and that metaphor holds up. But there's also another type of alien narrative that we're going to really focus on today, and that's, I don't know, the word intimate might work here. It's something that's a bit closer to home. It's not your H.G. Wells story. It's not going to be, your action adventure story. So we're not talking about what we would see a lot, especially like in the 90s with things like Independence Day or even Mars Attacks. We've talked about that on this podcast. But what we're talking about here is actually the flying saucer and this kind of narrative of being out, usually somewhere very remote. It usually happens in like a small towns, like really small towns, or out in the wilderness somewhere where there's only a few people there to witness what happens. And then usually at least one of those people ends up getting abducted and taken up into the spaceship, and then they come back and report everything that happened. So that's something I think that is really unique to this type of alien invasion story, is it's not always going to be, big guns blazing, trying to fight off somebody coming in. Some of these are much more small in nature, but that almost makes them more terrifying. And so that's what we're going to really kind of look at today. So just to kind of give you an overview, if we're looking at the actual history of it, now there's been a lot. We're not going to speculate on this podcast right now about all the things that the government knows and the government doesn't know. We'll leave that to other podcasts. But there are some, the first reports of flying saucers really go all the way back to the 1940s. And we're still talking about UFOs today that people say the military knows about. I think they've released a whole bunch of papers, but in the mess of 2020, I think that got lost in a lot of things. But this goes back, really documented to around the 1940s. Again, I feel like it makes sense if you look at what was happening then with World War II, that there was a lot of fears around what would happen there, around a possible invasion of the United States. So it makes sense that these kind of fears were manifesting in what people would see and what people would think about aliens kind of coming in. And then that bled over into fiction. So in the 1950s and the 1960s, you kind of get some of these alien and UFO movies. So some of them were more, I think, comic. Some of them were definitely sci-fi. A lot of them were sci-fi, but you still had these narratives, the real life narratives of people across the country saying that they were seeing different things. I'm just going to brush over this briefly, but in 1961, there was a couple, that a really famous couple, that claimed that they had an encounter with aliens. So maybe this would be better to call these like alien encounters and not really alien invasions, because invasions just does feel to me more wide scale. But we're going to save that because that's for our Patreon. So for those of you who don't know, I'm going to give a quick plug for our Patreon. If you sign up for our Patreon, you can get access to mini episodes on the weeks in between our main episodes. And one of the ones that we're doing for this alien invasion series, I'm really excited about. It's on this couple who said that they had an alien encounter, again, very famous. But once you kind of get past, again, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, these alien narratives really didn't go away. And in the 70s and 80s, we saw a lot of these alien stories. But I do think you see them changing a little bit, because they do become more of the alien encounter, where it's one or two people encountering the aliens rather than a wide scale war or invasion of aliens. And that's what we're talking about today. We're going to be looking at Fire in the Sky. It is the 1993 movie that is based on a book that came out in 78. That's why I said the 70s and 80s are kind of the prime time that we're focusing on. So a little bit about the book, and then we'll kind of get into our discussion about this. But the movie is based on the Walton experience by a man named Travis Walton. So he was a lumberjack who lived in Arizona. I think the town was called Snowflake, if I remember right. But it was November 5th, 1975. He was with a group of friends in a forested area, so actually outside of the town. And they were in a truck. I want to say they were 6 of them. And they saw something. They saw a bright light. They saw something which they called a UFO, which I think even a saucer was mentioned, out in the wilderness. Travis got out to investigate, got out of the truck that they were all in, and apparently he was abducted. This is what we do know. Walton disappeared for 5 full days. His friends didn't know what happened to him. They went back to town. They said, they were like, we don't know what happened out there. And people just kind of assumed that he was missing and probably dead out in the woods, until they found him again 5 days later walking down the highway. So he says that he was taken up in this alien ship. He wrote a book about it. His friends, from what we can tell, corroborated what happened, as far as that they all saw the lights, they all saw the strange thing. But there's a lot of people who are skeptical of this account that said he just made it kind of up for money. But it's a very famous in the UFO community. It's a very famous book. Travis Walton is still making, I think, the rounds in the UFO convention circuit. And of course, his book, The Walton Experience, was turned into Fire in the Sky, which came out in 1993, directed by Robert Lieberman and starring D.B. Sweeney as Travis himself. All right, so that's kind of a little overview. I don't know, before we jump in, I'm curious, Matt and Mel. I mean, first of all, had you seen Fire in the Sky before? And were you a big, I don't know, consumer might be the wrong word, but did you watch any of these or follow any of these abduction stories or like alien encounter movies in the 80s at all? Or I guess early 90s too, since that's what we're talking about today.
Well, I guess I'll jump in here, since I know you addressed both of us, so give Mel a turn as well. But yeah, I saw Fire in the Sky probably not long after it came out. I didn't see it in the theater, but I did rent it when it first came out on video. So I don't know if that would have been 1993 or early 94. I don't remember the exact timeline, but I did watch it. And as a person growing up in the 90s, I was also a pretty big fan of The X-Files, this little cult TV show that hardly anybody watched. I'm joking, of course, but so yeah, I mean, that was actually, I think, how I came to have the interest in watching Fire in the Sky when it came out. Was I think I had been watching The X-Files and having those, that running theme of alien encounters and those sorts of things throughout the show. And then this movie came out and I thought, oh, well, I really want to see that. It's based on a true story. As I don't know, I mean, I guess I don't know how much of it I completely buy into, if that makes sense. I'm definitely not a skeptic who doesn't believe aliens exist at all. I definitely think that given the vast size of the universe, it's definitely pretty likely that there's other life out there and probably other intelligent life out there. Why they would want to come to Earth and kidnap people is kind of where I'm not entirely sure. And so that's where I sort of, that's where the skeptic starts to kind of come out in me. And, but yeah, I definitely followed the, the sci-fi and whatnot trend of the 90s of really being interested in these sorts of abduction and encounter stories, for sure. Oh, and of course, unsolved mysteries. They would sometimes have weird encounters that would sometimes be aliens as well. And I just devoured that show. That was a great show.
For me, this was my first time watching Fire in the Sky, as far as I know. I feel like when you guys mentioned doing it, I'm not even sure if I recognized it right off the bat. I feel like it was kind of off my radar, unless it's something that I heard about as a kid or saw on TV or something. I just don't remember, but I think I would remember it. So yeah, this was my first time watching the movie. It was interesting to me in that while I was watching it, I was just checking off in my head all the stuff that was happening that we all just know happens with alien encounters or abductions, with like losing radio stations and vibrating objects and seeing lights in the sky. And I mean, I can't even remember all the things that are going on. Being not remembering things when you come back, and et cetera, et cetera. Being in a remote location, all of that. After this got me remembering Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and so I watched that actually after I watched Fire in the Sky, and it was interesting seeing like there's just this running theme kind of what happens in alien encounters and abductions. And from some of my reading, it seems like a lot of that kind of comes from that encounter that the couple had in 61 that you talked about, that you mentioned, Lisa, as like a founding kind of, I guess, document for this sort of theme or motif. I don't remember specifics about why I was interested in aliens as a kid. I really don't, but I do remember being fascinated by it. I remember being interested in the idea of seeing strange things in the sky. I'm assuming it's probably because I caught some Unsolved Mystery episode that Matt referenced, or something like, those news programs that would be on and talk about weird things or something like that. Maybe there was something I was reading, but I definitely remember being a little kid and being fascinated by what could be outside. My uncle had a telescope, and so he would, show me cool things in space with a telescope at night. And I just was fascinated by the possibility of something being out there. Like Matt, I do not foreclose the idea that there's life out there in the universe because it's so big. Like Matt, I also wonder why they would do some of the things that they do in these encounters. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, saying whether I believe or don't believe it, I'm not sure I can say that, but I did I approached the movie as like a film I was watching. I didn't approach it as a documentary, though it has a feel of a documentary sometimes, or like a made for television type reenactment feeling, until you get to when he's in the alien ship, which I thought was fascinating, and I know we'll talk about that later. But yeah, I guess that's my experience. I can't put my finger on what it was. I just feel like the fact that I can't put my finger on what it was that had me thinking about it as a kid or interested in it just shows how steeped we were in this in pop culture and on TV in the 80s and the 90s in particular.
Yeah, it wasn't until we were really prepping for this episode, and I think that's why I wanted to hear both of your thoughts on this, because I had seen this movie before, and I remember being really scared by the scenes in the alien ship. But other than that, I don't remember the movie really making that big of an impression on me. And so I kind of had to do like a little bit of a rewind in my brain. And Mel, when you said that we were really steeped in it, I in our childhood, I feel like that is so correct because it was something that was so present that I don't think I acknowledged it until I really started looking at it. So you mentioned Spielberg, who I know for anybody who, I mean, like us, we love books, we love movies, we love storytelling. And if you grew up at a certain time, like Spielberg was just kind of, I don't know, almost godlike in our lives at some point. But you had like Close Encounters of the Kind, E.T., which was my one of my favorite movies growing up, which is definitely it's interesting because that movie isn't scary in the same way that, like, say, Fire in the Sky is. I remember being terrified mainly of the government in that movie, but the like officials who rush in. But I mean, that absolutely is an alien encounter movie. It fits the same way. Even when I think about like the families kind of, well, they're in like a suburb, but their house backs up to all that field, and so it has that kind of that backyard has that isolated feeling to it. And when Elliot first sees ET, and there's the lights and the noise and all that, and it has that feeling of all of these alien encounter narratives I've heard. I mean, even the saucer, of course, coming down in the woods, like that's iconic. But you know, we had those stories. Another one of my favorite movies growing up was Flight of the Navigator, which again is a little boy who goes up in a spaceship. It's that in and of itself is not terrifying. What's terrifying in that film is when he comes back and realizes that time has passed on without him. That's really the disturbing part. But actually in the ship that's the fun part, right? That was the part I was always entranced with. So again, it's a different feel than like a Fire in the Sky type thing. But still, these were formative stories in my childhood. And then Matt, you mentioned a few, like X-Files, of course. By the time the 90s rolled around, for me it was more of the unsolved mysteries, because that's what I watched every day when I came home from school. Were these kind of, it was unsolved mysteries, and then there were a few of those other news shows. I'm using news loosely because it was kind of an unsolved mysteries type stories, where people would share what happened to them. And it was almost to the point that it was a joke with people that if aliens landed, they landed in like a cow field somewhere in the middle of America and grabbed a random farmer. Like those were just the stories that circulated constantly. So I did find it fascinating kind of looking through that lens and then rewatching Fire in the Sky. And kind of it was a dismantling for me of those things that I've always just kind of taken for granted, like those stories. I mean, I don't really have an opinion either way on whether or not these stories are actually real. Like, I'm really curious to dig into that Betty and Barney Hill story on our Patreon and just kind of like look at it, because that is presented as something that is very much real. And this one, even though it is supposed to be based on a real story, it still has that cinematic feel to it. Mel, I also agree with you too, by the way, about a lot of this film feeling like a reenactment by actors, especially the scenes where they're telling the officials what happened and everybody assumes they're like a murder happened, essentially. That goes along with every like scene in Unsolved Mysteries I remember seeing growing up, where you would have the person telling the story, but then you would have the actor reenactment of it. And that really reminded me of it. So yeah, it's really, really kind of fascinating that this, I feel like this was a part of our childhood much more than it is like kids growing up today. Like, I don't know if I really hear my kids watching or reading anything in the in just the gross amount that we did. But let's jump into the movie. I guess that's what we're here to talk about. You have in the movie, just to give you a little bit of kind of background, you have the character of Travis. We get a little bit of his background. We get a sense of kind of this small town in Arizona. There's a little love story, the idea that he just proposes to his girlfriend. So you get the sense of like a man who's just starting his life, which I think is supposed to add to it. And you get his disappearance. And the movie, I thought, this is what surprised me watching it, is that it was really slow, I thought, up until the point where you actually see what happens to him. Because at least I knew, I feel like most of us did, but like you knew he was going to come back and tell what happened. So a lot of it, when they were just, the friends were being interviewed by the cops, that wasn't really too interesting to me, because it was more of just, okay, well, the cops think he's dead and they're trying to solve a murder. They don't really believe the alien thing. The only thing that I found interesting that really kind of surprised me, because I didn't remember it, was before we actually see what is happening in the alien ship, like we kind of get his memories of what happened. Because he's obviously very traumatized when he comes back. Like he can't even speak. He's having these kind of flashbacks that are like reminiscent of like war flashbacks. Or what I found really fascinating was the town meeting that they had, where basically the townspeople were turning against his friends who were insisting that he had been taken by an alien. And the townspeople were basically saying, you've got to stop telling people this. Like it was really interesting to see the way the town kind of got up in arms, and they were just like, we don't like you telling this story because it's scaring us and it's scaring our children. So we just want you to tell a different story, was essentially what I got out of that whole scene. But that's what I thought was really fascinating, is the way, because what you have in this movie, it opens, and I feel like we ought to mention this. It opens with a quote, and I might bungle it. It's something along the lines of chance makes a play thing of a man's life. Just kind of the idea that like one chance event can change your life for good or bad, and it can kind of totally upend things. And it kind of made me feel like, oh, this is like a really uncaring view of the universe. Kind of like we're in this big wide universe, but it really doesn't care about you at all. Which was kind of bleak, I thought. But I found it really fascinating that it wasn't just this man's life that was turned upside down when he disappeared. Obviously, his fiance's life was turned upside down. His friends were traumatized by what happened. But then the way the townspeople were kind of insisting that they not talk about aliens, which I thought was really, I don't know, I just thought there was something there. I don't know. What did you guys think about? I guess we ought to talk about the movie pre the alien ship. So any of that is fair game.
I agree with you that I was interested in that town meeting because I remember, and I think this is in my notes, I was thinking to myself, wow, these people who literally grew up with these guys, older people who knew them as children, and people who went to school with them would actually like to believe they're murderers rather than have someone tell them that aliens might have come. And I can totally see how someone may not believe that there were aliens, but it was like they had a whole town meeting just saying, "Why won't you just say these people murdered him?" Like you said, they didn't really care if it was the truth or not. They just so didn't want to think about the possibility of what it would mean that someone could be taken. I was also struck by that Seneca quote at the beginning of the movie too, because yeah, it is very like naturalistic in a way, and uh, not positive at all, not optimistic. But I felt like the movie was trying to bear it out in an interesting way because, like you said, it messed up everybody's lives. I had no idea James Garner was in this movie until I saw his name pop up. So it even messed up James Garner's character's life because he was like one unsolved mystery, even to his perfect record. But I thought the play between Travis and Mike, his best friend, was interesting because Mike, a couple people said, was like this pillar of the community, and the fact that people would rather think that he murdered someone or that he was protecting a murderer was more palatable to them, which was kind of shocking. But also, I felt like, yes, Travis kind of brought on himself by going out of the truck and going up to say hey to the aliens, which I was like, why on earth would you do that? And then they abandoned him, which is a big thing because he finds out he was kind of abandoned. But Mike does go back and try to help him. But it was really chance because any one of them could have gotten out of the truck and gotten kidnapped. It was just Travis whose personality pushed him to do that. Mike could have gotten kidnapped. When I was thinking of myself in those people's shoes, one, I was like, wow, I don't know if I could say what I saw because I know it'd just be so outlandish. And two, if I'm in those characters' shoes, I'd be like, that could have happened to me. Like that could have happened to anybody. And the fact that it was Travis that was taken and upends his entire life, it also upends Mike's entire life too. It's like this one moment changed everything. And so, yeah, at first when I saw that quote, I was like, well, why begin with that? But if Travis hadn't gotten out of that truck, he would have never experienced any of the horrific things that we see him experience on the ship. I feel like the way they structured it with all the background was to make us care about the characters and kind of flesh them out. But I agree with you, Lisa, that was kind of slow. Though it showed that Travis was kind of innocent, I guess, because Mike says he still needs to mature a bit before he can marry or whatever, because I guess he's not holding down regular jobs. I'm not sure. They were trying to flesh them out, but they didn't really give us a lot of history about them. But yeah, it really picks up once he comes back. But I don't know. I guess that's also what gave it the reenactment documentary type feel too, because it was more about like what was happening to the people left behind than Travis until the end. So yeah, I guess that's kind of my take on the three things that you had mentioned.
Well, just to throw my 2 cents in on the town and their reaction to everything. I mean, I find it kind of believable that they would assume that they were murderers instead of having been, had an alien encounter. I did not have an issue with that, I guess, because I mean, I guess it comes to that Occam's razor thing that if I were somewhere and somebody I knew said, "Oh, this guy disappeared," but no, we didn't. We were the last ones to see him, but we didn't murder him. He was taken by an alien. I'd think that they were full of it, because like most people, I haven't had an alien encounter myself, and so it seems like a far-fetched sort of response, I guess, to try to hide guilt. And again, obviously, he wasn't dead, and I'm not saying that. I mean, I am skeptical of the story, but at the same time, I don't know what he actually experienced. I don't believe that. Obviously, they didn't murder him because he wasn't dead. Don't know for sure what did happen to him. He may very well have been taken up by aliens, but I guess the reaction of the town people, even this being people that they've known all their lives, I guess it would be more believable to me that someone I've known for 20 years would commit murder than be abducted by an alien, if that makes sense. Like I don't know. I'm just trying to put myself in their shoes and think of if somebody I knew was being accused of murder and said, no, we didn't kill the guy, it was aliens, and I don't know, I would really I would have a hard time believing that, I guess. So that's just kind of my take on that. But obviously we find out very quickly that he wasn't dead. I think we all know going into this movie that he's not dead because he wouldn't have been around to write his memoir about it afterwards and be around for this movie. But I don't know. I'm starting to ramble, so I'll just sort of stop there. But I can see, I can understand that response when his friends are not believed and are looked at suspiciously and whatnot.
Yeah, I totally see what you're saying. If I put myself in their shoes too, I would probably be the same way. I think now that I'm thinking about it, I think it's the structure of the film because the film Like, unlike the townspeople, we saw something zap him and possibly take him. So I'm thinking about it now, and I'm like, I think from the perspective of the film and the way that it was structured, I was more suspicious of the townspeople than maybe I should have been. Also, I'm a fan of Shirley Jackson, so townspeople calling meetings creeps me out.
As it should, as it should. I don't trust public gatherings by any means, but no, the movie itself is definitely structured so that we are placed kind of in the points of view of the loggers, and so we're immediately sympathetic towards them, and that's just a choice that they made for sure. But yeah, I tried putting myself in the place of the townspeople and was like, I mean, I don't know, I can understand them going, well, to this story.
And they know that some of the people who went with him in the woods don't like him. Like, he
Right.
wasn't well liked by everybody in the town, apparently. Like, we know one guy threatened him. So yeah, if we put ourselves in their position, they're just like, Mike, we may like you, but you're covering up for something. Like, something happened. So yeah, I can see that.
I think for me, that town's, and you're right, that town's meaning was completely out of a Shirley Jackson story, which is probably why I did not trust it either. I think for me in that scene, it was when, I don't know, one of the townspeople was like, "You're scaring our children," and I thought, really, like, is that is that what we're going with? It's like, stop saying that because you're scaring the kids, like.
Oh well, no, that's a great point. I did mean to make that point too. I just lost it while I was rambling myself. But I completely agree with you about that reaction. That the stop talking about this because it's scaring the kids is a kind of stupid reaction. And
no, it's funny because you're right. I mean, you are right, Matt. You do make an excellent point that from the townspeople's point of view is probably really clear cut of, well, a group of you went out into the woods or were out in the woods and one of you did not come back. Therefore, if y'all are telling this wild, outlandish story, probably means you're covering up for the fact that one of you or a few of you ganged up on him and killed him. Like, that is a logical explanation. That is not only the Occam's razor, like, simplest explanation, but it's the logical one, because that's how those stories happen. Like, that's that is what happens. And Mel, as you said, he was not well liked, and one of those, I can't remember any of the characters. They all bleed in my head in this movie. But one of them, even said to the police, like, he wasn't my friend. I didn't like him. You're right. I did not like him. He was not my friend, but doesn't mean that I killed him. So yeah, I can see that. I think it was just the you're scaring our children, because I thought, I mean, this was coming at the end of the movie was coming at the end of the Satanic Panic. I guess the 1978 encounter would have happened right at the beginning, kind of the beginning of the Satanic Panic. But just the idea of, you can't say what's happening to you because it's going to scare the children and it's going to disturb them and it's going to somehow harm them. So just by hearing it, so now you've got to be quiet, which it was just one of my pet peeves. But I think we ought to kind of move to what I think, and I think what everybody thinks about this movie is what everybody talks about, is the alien encounter. Because one thing I think this movie does really well, and I think they did this intentionally, is a lot of the movie, and I mean, we've been describing it as kind of almost like a documentary style or a reenactment, but I think one of the things that we're kind of leaning towards is that it feels real. Like, the characters feel real, the town feels real. It feels like, yes, this is a small town drama that could be happening anywhere in this country. These people could be people that I meet anywhere. They're very relatable. In other words, they're completely ordinary people. And even after he disappears, it still feels that way. It still feels like, well, this is what would happen if somebody went missing in a small town. Like, this is the police would come in, there would be investigations, the townspeople would be suspicious, people would want to be getting to the truth, and emotions would run high as people were doing that. But when Travis actually returns and then we get to see what he's been through, the pacing of the movie speeds up in a way that is very jarring and is very disjointed. And again, I think this is intentional because it's getting us, I think, the closest to understanding what something like Travis would have been through, like what it would have been like. You're going through your life, everything feels normal, and then suddenly you're swept up into something that your brain almost can't even comprehend. Like it's that sudden. There's no way you could have anticipated it. And I feel like this movie does a really good job in taking the audience through that, because I don't know, like it's almost violent. That's the only way I can describe it. It's almost violent in the way it happens. Like, suddenly they're all wondering where Travis is, and then suddenly Travis is back, and then suddenly you're seeing all these like nightmarish things. And the same way there was the scene, I think, where we really get into his head and see what happened to him, is the scene where they're at the house and everybody's there. It's kind of like a party, and he flips out and goes under the table, and we see, so I can't even remember what it is. It's like maple syrup or something from the table that drips down. And then that's what like kicks him back into it. It's just abrupt. It is abrupt going into it, which I thought was really well done. And then the design of the ship, like the aliens themselves and what the ships look like. The only thing I wrote down is that aliens apparently mean just touching a lot of gross, gooey stuff. Everything seems very wet in a way I am not comfortable with. And it looks like something that H.R. Geiger like would have had in one of his nightmares. It's terrifying. Like, I'm laughing because I'm thinking back to it and I'm getting scared all over again. So I'm laughing because that's what I do when I'm scared. But it's a terrifying. It is not E.T. It is not Flight of the Navigator. This is terrifying. And for a movie came out in 1993, the special effects hold up beautifully today, I think.
Yeah, after the reenactment feel of the beginning, I was jolted. I think it did to me as a viewer exactly what they wanted to do. I agree that the effects felt pretty realistic, especially after we've been watching a 1970s period piece, basically, and then all of a sudden we're thrown into what a 1990s alien movie could be. And you've got a person who's been believably acting and looking like a 1970s person, like thrown into the future. I think that also helped the feeling of jarringness that we were feeling when we were watching it. Yeah, it was gross. It was, I hate to use this word, but it's the only thing I can think of, alien. I mean, it was very different. It was something that would be completely chaotic and jarring to you if you wake up in a cocoon surrounded by decaying bodies and a thing that makes no sense, and you're weightless for the first time in your life. I mean, the aliens don't say anything. I found them menacing. They were like taller ETs, but there was nothing ET about them, like you said. I thought, I think I might have mentioned this to you, Lisa, because I watched this movie earlier in the week, and I was just like, in E.T., I was scared of the government. In this movie, I was scared of the aliens. I mean, for sure. It was just, and then there were these uncanny moments that really got me. Like, I wrote down in my notes, like when they're dragging him through the ship, and there's a random kid's shoe floating around, and there's someone's glasses floating around. It's not that much, but it just made a pit in my stomach, because it's like, these are other people who went through this exact same situation and maybe didn't make it out. Like, the ship was just littered with the detritus of people's lives, and I was like, this is horrifying. And then when they do when they throw him on the surgical table and start like experimenting on him and whatnot. Like that was extremely intense. And like I said, like that was all very jarring to me because we've been in this logging town in the 70s for 3/4 of the movie, and then all of a sudden you're there, and I think it got Travis's, if this man was traumatized by this, then it really put us, I think, into that moment of like, here's an ordinary welcome home party, and then you're in something that's just completely, you just can't understand it. There's no communicating, there's no understanding anything, and then he's just kind of thrown out back into his life. And Matt, what are your thoughts on his floating around screaming and the alien ship horrifying part?
I honestly don't know if I have much more to add besides what you've both talked about. I mean, it was definitely unsettling. I completely agree with Lisa that there's that H.R. Geiger feel to it. It's the best part of the movie. I mean, I think we're probably all in agreement on that it's, I don't know, it's a different vibe from the first half, but it's the meat of it. I mean, this is what I came to see. This is what, well, back in when it first came out, that's what I was interested in, was this alien experience that he had. And that part did not disappoint for sure. Definitely creepy and unsettling. And I loved it even as I was uncomfortable watching it.
Yeah, it was. It's definitely the best part of the movie, and I want to stress, because I think we're all saying it, but this isn't one of those movies where I feel like you can, because it's on, like, the alien abduction scene, like the whole sequence of it is up all over the internet. I mean, so you could conceivably go to YouTube and just watch that part of the movie, which, if you want to be scared, definitely do that. But I want to, like, for listeners who haven't watched this or watched it in a while, I do recommend watching the whole movie, just because of the sensation you go through, kind of being lulled into a sense of, I don't know, a certain sense of safety, like watching the first part of the movie and then seeing that, because it is so just jarring and abrupt and just terrifying. Just, I think the feeling of sadness that you feel, Mel, you mentioned all the people's belongings that were on the ship. I think the despair that you would feel in something like that, because it's so foreign, it kind of makes you, like, I remember thinking when he woke up and he was kind of, the only way I can really describe it is like swimming through the ship, like the pods or whatever, or falling was kind of what he was doing. I don't know. It's you can't even find words, really, I think, to describe a lot of what you're seeing in this part. It is alien, Mel, as you said. It's just something that's completely unlike things that we've experienced before. But even as you're watching that, I remember thinking, in any other movie, like if this was an alien invasion movie with like Will Smith, right, where he's on the ship and now we're going to see him like fight the aliens and get off the ship, right, get back home and save Earth, and there, you didn't have that feeling that this could happen here. Like, I just remember thinking, okay, he woke up, what's he going to do? Like, where is he going to go? Because there was no escape at that point. And I think that was one of the terrifying things to me too, was just like, he couldn't communicate. Once you see the aliens, you realize like they have no interest in really communicating with him. And even if he tried to, I don't know if he could have. There was no sense of that he could reach out to find any like empathy with them, that somebody might, with ET, like we keep going back to that, but like with something like ET, and we should mention that Henry Thomas is also an actor in this film, which was a little strange to watch. I'm sure that was somewhat intentional. Apparently, Travis Walton and his wife also had a cameo in this film, like the real ones. I think they were in the townspeople, like that meeting scene. I don't know which ones they were though. Anyway, that was just an aside. But with something like ET or some of these others, you feel like there's a sense of communication between the alien life forms and humans, and there's some sort of like common ground that people can find. But with this, there wasn't that. And I realized that really early on in that scene. And I think that's what kind of led to this hopelessness that was really uncomfortable. And this idea of, okay, like he's not going to get out of this unless they decide to let him out. Like he's just here. There's no fighting to get out. And then especially like the I don't know, the experiment scene, I guess that's what it's called, but where they put him down on that table and the thing that looks like fabric, but it's like stone, and it kind of like sucks him down so he can't move. And there's this weird like Clockwork Orange eye thing going on. That was terrifying. It just, the sense of just not being able to even attempt to fight back or communicate your needs or your wants at all. It was just, it was terrible. It was again that kind of that uncaring universe feeling that the Seneca quote in the beginning, I think, was there for that reason. But yeah, it was just, that was a tough thing to confront. And I do want to say something too about the alien design. I thought was really cool. They look like the typical like gray aliens at first that people will describe when they talk about these alien encounters. And then you see that they're just like spacesuits almost, and you actually see the actual aliens that are in them. And they are this weird, like noseless, hairless, kind of old man looking things that are really terrifying. I thought for a moment they kind of looked like a if you had an old man and spliced it with Groot, you know, the tree, the dancing tree thing from Guardians of the Galaxy. That's kind of what they look like to me.
That is exactly what they look like. Only they were like angry and really mad looking the whole time.
Okay, yeah.
Too.
So angry old men spliced with Groot with no dancing. That's exactly what these guys look like. But yeah, it's a very bleak movie, and it just tough to watch, I think, but very well done. All right, well, I'm laughing at the old man Groot because really that's the best way to describe these things. So yeah, I don't know if I have much more to add on this movie. Yeah, most of these alien invasions, I feel like focus on, you know, what happens beforehand, like seeing the actual saucer and people kind of wondering what's happening. That's certainly kind of where X-Files, I think, goes, because you can kind of play up the skeptic nature of it too. But this one really leans heavily into Travis's account of what actually happened. And if true, yeah, it is a very uncaring look at our universe, which is very bleak. But yeah, so I think that's going to wrap up our discussion of Fire in the Sky. I'm really glad we got to rewatch this one. And I'm really excited we're doing this series. So we've got something really fun planned for our next main. I hope you join us then. And for those of you on Patreon, you know, we're going to be recording that Betty and Barney Hill, which really influenced this movie. In fact, I think some people have pointed out that Travis and his family had watched a TV version of the Betty and Barney Hill story just maybe a few weeks or months before his encounter. So it was definitely, the stories are intertwined in really interesting ways. So I'm really excited for those of you who are members over at Patreon to listen to that. Well, for everybody, we are at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. We would love it if you guys would reach out. So if you've seen this movie, or maybe we missed one of your favorite ones from this time period, let us know. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. You can reach out to us there as well. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to exclusive content like that Betty and Barney Hill episode. Plus, we've got 5 seasons worth of backlogged episodes you can listen through. You can simply rate and review us as well. That is entirely free, and it also helps other listeners find us. Theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.